Okay, so welcome everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Jesus Sanjurjo. I'm a lecturer in Hispanic and Latin American Studies at the University of Cardiff. And with me are Jenny Nelson and Charlotte Hammond, also lecturers here in Cardiff University. And we're very, very happy to have Professor Manuel Barcia from the University of Leeds, Chair of Global History at the University of Leeds with us today. Manuel is a world-leading expert in the history of the slavery and slave trade in the Atlantic world. He's a prolific author. This is the fourth book, Manuel? The fifth book, and one more on the way already. So yeah, a very prolific author. And today he's going to be talking about his latest book, in which he studies the history of epidemics and its combination or its relationship to the slave trade and in slavery. For our students in the audience, we've been asked you to work on one particular chapter from this book, from chapter 5. For any student at the University at Cardiff University, we've put in the chat the information about the book. It's available in the library, so you can both access the book as a physical copy and online through the library website. For those of us watching from outside Cardiff University, the book's available to buy at the Yale University Press website. So without any further introduction, Manuel, I'm going to pass it to you. Thank you very much for being, even if virtually, at Cardiff University. It's a real pleasure to have you here. And yeah, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, first of all, let me thank all the people who invited me, especially the ones who I can see on the screen, Russell and Charlotte, and you and Jenny. What you didn't say, of course, is that both you and Jenny were my PhD students back in the day. So for me, this has been a very special event. I've been looking forward to this one in particular. Okay, so I'm going to try to be as quick as I can. I'm going to be talking about the book. This is a book, by the way. And it's really not my last book anymore. But anyway, there was one after. I don't know. I don't want to say the same thing that I have been saying in every other presentation I've made of this book, but I'm trying to keep to the topic at hand. And this is a book that I started writing as a result of many years working on archives, finding information about medical issues that kept popping up in the historical sources. I was working on other completely unrelated topics. I mean, the only related topic here is that I was working on the slave trade and the slavery, but I was looking at what I specialized before, which was mostly the forms of resistance, African warfare, etc. And somehow I ended up with a significant amount of information that was kind of a challenge. It would put me in a crossroad. I had to decide whether I wanted to write a book, which entailed learning medical history, as in sitting down and reading everything I could find, and try to figure out my place in this story, which is not as easy as it seems. Medical history is not one single field. It's quite compartmentalized. There is a lot to learn, and so I tried to stick to the things that I had to learn the most. It was also a kind of a very exciting challenge, in the sense that for the first time I actually had the opportunity to do something I always wanted to do, which was to bring into a coherent narrative the histories of different peoples, different regions, which were written in different languages. One of the challenges of this book that this book presented was to first to find the documents that I needed. And more often than not, I ended up going to archives that were spread all over the Atlantic, following Leeds. I also had the opportunity or the benefit of quite a few colleagues who are also my friends, who shared information with me from archives I couldn't get to because they were very far, or it was very expensive to get there. So that was one challenge. The other challenge was to actually be able to read all these documents because many of them were pretty much straightforward. They were in Spanish, English, or Portuguese, but I also had to read documents in other languages, which I'm just about able to read to make out. But sometimes I actually had to again to ask for help from colleagues who were able to translate bits and bobs that I just didn't trust Google Translate to do for me. There is one thing here as well, is that as a historian, sometimes you start working on a topic and you really don't know what kind of impact your article or your book is going to have once it comes out. I started writing this book, like seriously, I started writing this book back in 2014, if I recall well, maybe 2015. And the last thing in my mind was that I was going to have a book out on diseases, including epidemics, on ways of controlling epidemics, and all this in the middle of a global pandemic, which of course made the book to a certain extent more readable, more desirable for people to read. But again, this all came in a very, very organic way. I didn't plan for this, I promise you. If I had a crystal ball, I'm writing about piracy now, so if the form is anything like that, expect big problems with piracy within the next 5 years, all over the place. Anyway, so to get back to the serious bits, I also realized that there were quite a few interesting caveats to write this book. The first one is that most of the medical history of the slave trade, the one written until today, has been written for what we consider the legal period of the slave trade, which is up to 1807, give or take. It actually is more complicated than that, because the British do abolish the slave trade in 1807, but the slave trade continues in the Atlantic well after that, even legally for some countries. And of course, there is still human trafficking in the Indian Ocean well into the 20th century. So this is not, and sometimes this human trafficking is starting in the Indian Ocean, but it's moving towards the Atlantic. So for me, it was quite tempting to have the opportunity to write out a period that it is until today badly studied. So in many ways, this book actually it can stand on itself just because it's addressing a problem within a period for which we have very, very little. There are quite a few books on medical history of slavery, mostly in the United States and Brazil, but the transatlantic slave trade hasn't been central to any of these studies. For me, a non-medical historian, there were quite a lot of traps, methodological traps and theoretical traps. The methodological traps freaked me out from day one. I was very scared of doing any sort of history that wasn't going to make any sense, or of repeating tropes that were first established in the, I don't know, the 17th, 18th, 19th century. Unfortunately, we are living in a period in which when you try to do something new with history, people actually ask you, people actually criticize you because you're writing history. But what we do, what historians do, is write history. So for me, I had to avoid a few traps. One of his traps, I actually thought it was quite important to avoid, was to repeat this narrative of the European or Westerner, the Western doctor, medical practitioner, or military officer or Navy officer arriving in the transatlantic slave trade contact zones and pretty much superheroing his way around the place, saving everybody. He's a white savior, which is something that we still see until today. A few years ago, there was a scandal with Oxfam in Haiti, and one leading historian, one leading British historian, well-known public figure, came out and pretty much justified the brutalities of the British Oxfam workers had committed in Haiti, basically justifying it by saying that this happened because they were in a disaster zone. So basically, it was not them; it was the disaster zone that created this. So this narrative is not hasn't gone away, right? So what I tried to do was to focus on the life of ordinary people, on the actions of ordinary people. And I did my best, and this is something Jesus and I were talking a little bit before the talk began, to bring out the histories of the people with a history, especially African practitioners and Africans who knew botany or surgical techniques or whatever into the fold, right? However, to do that, I had to rely mostly, majoritarily, almost exclusively on Western sources. So there are silences there. We know, for instance, that women practice medicine, both in Africa and Americas, but there is very little to go by. So the only thing that I could do was actually to mention this, to try to point towards the silences in the sources, but I cannot fill out the silences if I don't have the primary sources, the evidence to fill out the silences. So we know that certain things were happening, but very often they were happening beyond the gaze of the European or the Westerner, and therefore they were not recorded. And sometimes it happened in front of them, and I said they weren't recorded because they were seen as backward or savages or whatever else Europeans thought of them. Something else that I tried to avoid was to follow in this sort of Whiggish narrative of history that we saw in the past. We have been breaking out with this narrative in the past few years. But in the case of medical history, it's actually quite problematic because we have this, there is a general idea in the general population, and you can see this reading newspapers, for instance, that medical knowledge is a one direction, lineal, improving, it's in a one direction, lineal improving journey. And I had to stay away from that as well, because this is not the case. Medical progress, medical practices, and the good medicine, the race of good medicine, they did not happen, or they do not happen in a linear way. Medicine, like any other science, has ups and downs. There are moments in which there are breakthroughs, and then 20 years later, people have found out that the breakthrough actually was not a breakthrough, was wrong. So you have an idea, not to put any bad idea in your head, but in the past 20 years, and Jesus and Jenny both know me very well, and they know that I have a particular affinity with coffee, particularly espresso. In the past 20 years, I have found all kinds of articles that say that espresso has brilliant qualities and it can improve your life. And then, you know, only a few months later, there are other articles that are saying if you keep drinking espresso, you're going to die much sooner. So this is the kind of things, and all of them are based on studies, okay? And this is the same thing we are seeing with vaccines in the middle of this pandemic. If I have been looking at the history of epidemics in the 19th century in the transatlantic slave trade, and I didn't find, so far, I have never found a single case of anyone in these contact zones refusing to be vaccinated or inoculated against smallpox. Not once, okay? It could have happened, it almost certainly happened. But wherever inoculation or vaccination arrived, people were willing to give it a try because they knew, they have seen the effects of a smallpox, what smallpox could do to people. And yet, 200 years later, in 2021, we have huge discussions with anti-vaxxers about whether we should take vaccines or not. One of the vaccines has been pretty much sabotaged because it has a rate of 1 in 17 million deaths. It goes beyond anything. By the way, so that you know, smallpox was eliminated from the face of Earth in the 1970s, right? And the smallpox vaccine had much worse effects than any other vaccine. And it has, as far as I understand, the highest mortality of any vaccine ever created. But we got rid of the disease. There is no smallpox in the world we inhabit. I was one of the last people to get the vaccine. So this is what a common enemy for all the actors that I study in this book. This meant that people who normally would have fought with each other, they decided to cooperate. Very often they took the high road and they decided to cooperate with each other. I'm happy to expand on this. But they were more than happy to change knowledge, to exchange surgical procedures, how to cure a disease, to exchange breakthroughs as well, anything that was state of the art, anything that had just have been demonstrated, they would pretty much try to use it. So it is these Atlantic actors that are at the center of a book, and especially chapter 5, by the way, and how they interacted in the contact zones, how they shared this fragmentary medical knowledge, to quote Pablo Gomez, and how all these exchanges led to a change in the medical culture of the 19th century that also led to a change in the medical corpus of the 19th century. There is one last thing that I would like to mention here that I think is important, and it is that the abolition of the slave trade is at the very center of this story. It's pretty much at the core of it, and one unexpected result of one unexpected finding of this research is that abolition actually caused very often more damage. It caused a huge level of human suffering as British, French, American ships blockaded slave traders, slave dealers in alongside the coast of Africa. Those men and women and children who were being traded, who were being trafficked, they had to spend longer periods in the barracoons. They had to, where they didn't have any kind of or very poor medical infrastructure, treatments, etc., etc. So there is that as well. So to start wrapping this up, there are a couple of things, methodological things that I actually want to highlight. In order to have a clear mind of what I wanted to do and to be able to portray what I wanted to do, I look at 4 stages of how Atlantic actors dealt with diseases. So I look at prophylaxis, which pretty much also had to do with how we deal with environments, with human behavior, etc., etc. And I also look at diagnosis, prognosis, and the treatment of diseases. So and I did this in 3 specific environments. The first one was slave ships and factories, and I could have split them into slave ships and slave factories. The reason I didn't do that is because I didn't have enough material to have a chapter for each. And the reason for that is precisely because they were illegal in this period. So the documents, even though there are enough documents to write something, the documents are not as forthcoming and as plentiful as they are for the legal side of this history. So slave ships and slave factories, they have poor medical facilities. They had poor medical provision. There was overcrowding. There was poor hygiene. They were being pursued by anti-slave trade patrols. So very often the situation in these places for those who were being trafficked was dire, to say the least. I also look at anti-slave trade patrol ships. So these were the ships that they were employed by different countries to attack and rescue enslaved Africans. And of course, they were the first line of containment. They are the first one to come into contact with diseases. And I also look at what I call anti-slave trade reception centers, which are the places where Africans are going to be taken once ships are captured. And of course, here, even though there was a better organization of better infrastructure, medical supplies were more forthcoming as well. Still, the situation was quite desperate because very often they were dealing with diseases that they could not understand very well. And this is happening in the mid-19th century. This is the period that the medical historians refer to as the age of heroic medicine. In the contact zone, in the transatlantic slave trade, this heroic medicine is more like heroic medicine on steroids. Right? Medical experimentation is rife. The conditions of existence of people are terrible, and you have to start with the fact that this is a human trafficking business already at this time. The moment it becomes illegal, it's not just slave trade, it's also human trafficking, right? As we consider it today. So to wrap this up, a few things. The first one is that things that I learned, let's say, no conclusions, things that I learned. To my surprise, one of the first things that I learned is that there was quite a lot of cooperation. There was a lot of interest in learning from each other in this period from every Atlantic actor, or almost every Atlantic actor. So definitely Atlantic actors from every walk of life, to put it correctly. People were happy to exchange information, to trade knowledge. And of course, these exchanges is what is going to change, what's going to affect how medical cultures are going to change in this period, to develop. All the knowledge, the medical knowledge that is going to be produced in this period, the medical corpus of the 19th century is going to be affected not only by European or Western doctors or practitioners, but also by non-European, non-Western practitioners, mostly Africans, but there are also some from the Americas. And that also goes for the botany, that also goes for basically any aspect of this story. And one last thing that I would like to mention is that medical knowledge, and this is something we're seeing as well today with COVID-19, medical knowledge was also kind of a weapon, right? It was used by the powerful to get away with things that they would normally not get away with. There is an Australian historian, Alison Bashford, and she has talked about how lines of hygiene can be turned into boundaries of rule. So you start taking care of the disease and you start legislating, you start taking measures that eventually are going to give you control over populations. And this need for hygienic containment, or what Bashford called the dream of hygienic containment, is going to hit an expansionist agenda in the 19th century. Okay, so this expansionist agenda is not difficult to see. It's for all to see. It's a choice whether you actually want to go down that rabbit hole or not. But this expansionist agenda can be seen in the access to new markets, can be seen in the control of populations, how populations were controlled, and it can be seen in the territorial expansion of the Western powers that are arriving in Africa at the time. So I'm going to leave it there. I'm happy to talk, to answer questions or anything else. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that, Manuel. I want to say before I make some comments that the Q&A section is open for everyone to start making their comments, and they are sending their questions. So you don't have to wait until the final bit of the session to actually send them. Also, if you want to make your question on video or opening your mic, please let me know, and I'm more than happy to do that as well. But just so you know that the Q&A section is open. I'm going to start, if that's okay with Jenny and Charlotte. I think that one of the very powerful things about this book, well, it couldn't have been, as you said, right? It couldn't have been published in a more interesting time to have this conversation, and also a time we were talking about this before we started the session, is that in which we have all confronted a lot of previous conceptions that we have about disease, pandemics, medical knowledge, and we've all been, personally challenged, I think, in our understanding of medicine and control of diseases. So yeah, I think that it's absolutely fascinating that we're having this conversation, in this very specific climate. I think that one of the very interesting contributions that the book does is that throughout those 4 stages that you've described, the prophylaxis, diagnosis, prognosis, and treatments, the underlying vector, if you want, or the things that bring all together and that are quite relevant in the creation of the Atlantic world, is the idea of social control. The underlying factors that determines the different imperial policies that are going to be put in place is the control of the population, and that of course has a reasonable aspect to it. And I think that the comparisons with the current situations are obvious. Like, you want to control the diseases, you want to make sure that the population survives, you want to make sure that people don't get infected and so on. So you establish certain controls, but obviously those controls are also going to be mediated by ideology, prejudice, racism, and a lot of other factors. So I would like to start, if you could tell us a bit more, because this is something that our students are really engaging with, is this idea of how central, how fundamental the history of the slave trade and the history of slavery is to the creation of Western modern societies, to the creation of the Atlantic world. And I would like if you could elaborate a bit more on this idea of controlling people as a fundamental part of what 19th century politics is about, what imperialism is about, and to what extent how it's linked to other perhaps legacies, obvious legacies of this period that could be, racism, white supremacist ideologies, post-imperialism, things like that.
It's social control, but it's also the control of environments, of natural environments. Natural environments are going to be also central to all these discussions, and for very similar reasons, actually. I mean, we are living through a pandemic, and we have seen all sorts of attempts of restricting movement, of restricting interaction. We were talking before we start about the surfaces, the idea of COVID is barely transmitted by touching surfaces. So the truth is that there has to be a distinction here. COVID-19 is a disease that began in November 2019. It's very, very new. I mean, and yet we have vaccines. We are actually on the way to getting rid of it, hopefully. But there has been, and that's what I actually found so fascinating living through this pandemic, because there have been parallel things to what I saw in the 19th century, right? But what I saw in the 19th century for decades, not for a year, right? Because we have now the tools to map the DNA of the virus, to figure out vaccines within months. If I recall well, by May last year, we were already having trials of certain vaccines. So there's a significant difference right there. But still, because it's a new disease, I was able to actually identify many things that happen that I saw in the 19th century happening now. Like, for instance, the control of populations, lockdowns. We didn't know they worked at the very beginning, right? We were trying to figure out whether it was a 1 meter rule or a 2 meter rule or a 3 meter rule, whether ventilation, which is very fundamental to the 19th century as well, had a role to play. And then again, quarantines as well, lockdowns. And again, the use of face masks. And again, if you look at the 19th century, what is happening over there, they are dealing with these same things, but not for a year. They are dealing constantly over time with this because they really don't have the tools to identify what is causing each disease and what it is more. They are very confused as to what disease is which. Fevers, and I actually make a point in the book about this. Fevers, there were many fevers. Some of them were viral fevers, okay, like the dengue or the yellow fever, right? And then you have bacterial fevers or parasitical fevers like malaria, or you have bacterial fevers like typhus and typhoid. And all of them look alike. They look like each other. So it takes time for people to be able to actually identify which one is the one that we're dealing with. And so, of course, controlling people was to a certain extent justified. And there were people who were more than happy to call for curfews, for quarantine spaces, for any disease, for what it worked, for, I don't know, not to have sex, not to drink alcoholic beverages, not to drink coffee, and almost anything could be brought to a table and say, you know what, maybe this is what we have to do to stop this from happening. Quarantines, for instance, were significant because they were almost imposed everywhere. And quarantines are a measure that actually, even when they don't work, they give a spectacle. They offer a spectacle. So even if you're not in control of the disease, at least you're telling people we are doing the best we can to control what is happening here. So in Havana, you had quarantines, or I say Havana, but this happened everywhere. You have quarantine stations, upwind, so that you wouldn't, downwind, sorry, so that you wouldn't get the wind going there. And they were putting every patient there. And for some diseases, they may work, say smallpox. But for other diseases like yellow fever or dengue fever, they would not work because the mosquitoes were able to fly 50, 100 meters. And that's all you need, right? So they gave an opportunity. The epidemics always give an opportunity to those who are in power to play a little bit with the social fabric, to do social engineering. And the problem is pretty much who you have in power, because then, I mean, I had a conversation recently with somebody talking about this, and I was saying, no, you know, we had a really bad run with the Tories. I mean, they got it kind of right with the vaccine. They got it tremendously wrong with other things. And there have been quite a lot of cronyism and corruption. But try to imagine what our position would be if we had a party, I don't know, like the what was the name of the Brexit party in charge with Nigel Farage? We would be screwed, all of us. So there are always shades to every story, you know.
Absolutely. Jenny, do you know?
That really relates to what we've actually looked at in the class in one of the modules, where hopefully everybody will be attending today. Thinking about the yellow fever epidemic in Brazil in the 19th century, and also, in fact, there were revolts against smallpox vaccine later on in the post-abolition period, and that was really about, you know, restructuring Rio and destroying some of the city slums and designing it socially. So thank you for
definitely, and the vaccine revolt, which we co-taught in Leeds, by the way, you and I in the same module. The vaccine revolt is a classic example of social engineering, but and why people resist social engineering. But I will make a point that the vaccine revolt of 1904 in Rio de Janeiro is still going on. It never went away. Okay, both the social measures that created and the actual revolt, they are still happening today more than ever.
I think that's a very interesting point, and you know, I want to go to the questions in the Q&A, but I think that another element that I found quite interesting in the book is the idea of how can you expect people to trust those in powers to implement those decisions to control the population or control the environment, when in many cases you have not really taken people on board first as part of a wider discussion of how we fight on this together, isn't it? And I think that particularly when we look at the intervention of white actors in West Africa, and, you know, this idea of the bringing of the knowledge, it's really surprising, as you were saying, to observe all these levels of cooperation, because I would have expected like a much greater resistance and the idea of like, and I think that happens probably because of the level of desperation was very high. The idea of like, anything that can save me, I'll give it a go, more than a complete trust in this person who is coming. But I think that there is also an element of that when we see people's reactions to official messages, is that it's difficult to get people on board with official messages when they have been neglected or ignored, or even like, you know, in the case of the control of societies in the 19th century, when the same people that are telling you that you have to do something for the sake of controlling a disease is also making very similar decisions for very corrupt and awful reasons. So it's difficult to trust those in power in those cases. So, but let me go to the Q&A questions. We have a question from Lola that says, "Hi Manuel, thanks for being here. How important do you think it is to include these types of positive medical exchanges in our discourse on the slavery? Do you think it might minimize the cruelty of the slave trade in any way?"
Thanks, Lola. I think it's very important, and I wouldn't say minimize it. If anything, it increases it. The only reason slave owners and slave traders wanted to cure and to improve the health of the human beings that were trafficking is because at the end of the day, there was a paycheck, right? This is not, they were trafficking human beings, okay? There was a paycheck at the end. That's the healthiest, the healthier and the better fed these Africans arrive in the Americas, the more money they would make, because the price of fetching markets would depend on the physical and mental actually state. But this actually goes even beyond slave traders, right? anti-slave trade patrols, they were making a killing, figuratively, by freeing Africans as well. Every African they freed was money from the captain of the ship down to the last sailor. The ships that they captured, they were usually either resold in auction or broken, and the pieces of whatever they were sold, very often they went back into the transatlantic slave trade because they would be bought by slave traders who were residing in the places where they would be sold. So there was a massive business here that include everybody, even the people who were doing this for the right reasons. They were making money out of it. And therefore you wanted they wanted to keep these people healthy. Plus there is another very, very important reason we should not forget. They also wanted to stay alive. Slave traders, they would die exactly the same way or sometimes even faster than the human beings that were trafficking, right? So these diseases would attack them and would kill them. Yellow fever it had a reputation of killing white people more than black people. And of course, there was a reason for that, is because Africans would get yellow fever in the childhood and they would die. Those who were going to that, they would die in the childhood. They would not make it into adulthood. And once you have had yellow fever, you never get it again. You're immune. And all the Europeans arriving in Africa, none of them had yellow fever, most of them anyway. But there are very clear financial reasons related to financial gain associated with these exchanges, right? They transform the ways we thought about diseases. They led to breakthroughs occasionally, but they were not always inspired by stoic is not the word for that, like pristine motives, or this is a dark history from whatever angle you look at it.
And I think, and this is also like an underlying message in your book across the different chapters, and I think you mentioned that in passing as well, is that how difficult it is to write a book in which you have to consider the role of certain white, in some cases abolitionists, who have perhaps the best intentions, but that participate of a system in a way that is much more complex. That the very traditional narratives of the William Falls and the Thomas Clarkson, who basically liberated all these Africans for the sake of humanity, is a much more complex picture.
And also common people, common sailors that found themselves in slave trading ships without knowing they were going to Africa, and suddenly they are involved in this story as well. They were not necessarily evil people, but they are going to participate in this. They are not going to jump ship when they get to Africa because this is a slave trade and I have principles. They are going to carry on, but this is not what they had in mind. So there is a human dimension to this history as well, to this story.
Absolutely. The next question is from Corey. She said, what kind of sources were you using when you were writing about the indigenous, not sure if that's the word that I should use, medical practitioners, given how Western medicine has traditionally rejected and diminished indigenous knowledge and practices? This is a really, really good question.
Thank you, Corey. It was a challenge. That was probably the biggest challenge of the book, is to find the sources and then to be able to do something with them, because very often they did dismiss and rejected and belittle African practitioners, but still they wrote about what they were doing, right? So the trick here is to actually not to fall in the same trap and dismiss what they said, is to try to interpret what they said. And in many cases, this is what happened. But in other cases, they were a little bit more open-minded, and they left testimonies based on empirical observation of what they saw. And some of them actually go on record as saying, I think that the way I remember this because this is one case, I think the way they what's the word for that? They amputate a leg or an arm is better than the way we do it with the knowledge that we bring from Europe. But there were also medical treatments that they were not necessarily surgical, that they also took on. And you have quite a few Europeans, not only medical practitioners, but Europeans in general and Western practitioners, who are going to acknowledge that both in the Americas and in Africa, the indigenous populations, if you want to use the term, are going to have a knowledge of botany that can actually transform medical cultures, that can change the way we deal with certain diseases and the way we treat certain diseases. And they are sometimes actually because they have something to gain as well from this, because they can actually find the herb that no one has used, but in Africa can show them and they can patent it and make money out of it, treating some kind of disease. But very often they are actually actively going to try to learn from these people. And the Africans and people in the Americas are going to try to learn from each other and from Europeans as well. This is not a one-way process. It's not like they were in an obscurantist bubble and they didn't want to learn new things. We have evidence, for instance, again, to go back to the vaccine, of Europeans arriving in Africa with the vaccine, talking to malams or imams in this case, and these people send the practitioners to learn the method to inoculate people. This is there. It's not missing in the sources.
Mm-hmm. I think that one of the things that is also something that we've been discussing in the module of slavery, abolitionism, and Black Atlantic with our final year students is how difficult it is to build histories and to create histories that don't insist on this idea that African history starts when Europeans arrive or when white people mediate, isn't it? And I think that you do a very conscious effort in the book to try to reflect on that. But as you were saying before, the problem very often is the sources, is the difficulty to access information to explain what was going on in Africa before these white sources arrive to the place. And I think that remains a challenge. One of the things that we were discussing with our students is how you are using sources in this book, and I think that that's particularly useful in the way that you're very open about the disclaimer in the book, and you say like, well, it's difficult. It's not a very straightforward process. The next question is from George. He says, "Hi Manuel, thoroughly enjoyed the talk. You mentioned the benefits brought to Western medicine by the contact and exchange over the period of the transatlantic slave trade. Are there any examples of the benefits of the change in other aspects of Western life, perhaps in terms of welfare or other examples?" I think you have a lot to say about that.
I wrote a book about that. Thanks, George. I'm not pretty sure whether you can actually call it a benefit to Western life, because warfare obviously brings, it doesn't bring, it's never, African warfare is never going to bring benefits to Europeans or to people in the Americas. It brought death and suffering. But there is a point that I don't even know how to answer this question, but there is a point that I want to make, which is that, and to pick up on something that Jesus almost touched on, the history of Africa and the history of the African doesn't start in the Middle Passage, and it doesn't start when they arrive in America. It starts in Africa. So everything, religion, music, the cosmologies, and cosmology, I'm talking about the stars, but I'm talking about how the understanding of the world, including how they use stars to a signal when you have to plant the seeds and when you have to collect the crops, but also warfare. All these things are going to cross the Atlantic. They will cross the Atlantic, and they are not going to cross the Atlantic from Africa to the Americas. They are going to cross the Atlantic from different parts of Africa with different cultures, different traditions, different understandings, and different pharmacopoeia, because the plants are not the same everywhere, to different parts of America, which again are different. And this actually has determines to what extent they may have an impact. And I'm going to use botany for this. Africa and South America were part, until I think it's until the Jurassic period, of a supercontinent that was called the Gondwana. Okay, they were the West Gondwana, the west part of this continent. And my understanding is that the Caribbean was also, the islands in the Caribbean were also the top notch of this supercontinent. And this supercontinent is going to split up in I think it's in Triassic, if I recall well. Like, it's been a long time since I read about this. So basically, if you look at the map, Brazil and West Africa, they pretty much fit like a puzzle, like two puzzle pieces. And the plant genera in both areas, the the pharmacopoeia in both areas, it's very close. Many plants are repeated, and many others are actually, they're not the same, but they're close enough so that those Africans who cross the Atlantic are going to find a correspondence, correspondent plants to what they are. And again, the stars, if you want to go down the path, the stars that they see in the sky are pretty much the same stars because they are all close to the equator, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there is a lot to signify here. So yeah, there is going to be a lot that is going to cross the Atlantic that is going to have an impact. If you go to a place like Brazil today, you're going to find candomblé, which is one of the main religions there. It's mostly African. If you want, almost anywhere in the Americas where Africans arrived, there are rhythms that are based on drums, and these drums are not coming from Europe; they're coming from Africa. Classical cases are salsa, samba. So yes, there is a constant impact and influence of other African exchanges that are going to have an impact in the Americas and in Europe as well.
Yeah, we're having a conversation in the chat. One of our colleagues was asking how striking
Mr. Whitfield, Dr. Whitfield.
How striking it was the idea of seeing the abolition as harmful to the African people, and I think that that perhaps can be linked to something that we've also explored in our modules, both in cultures in context and in slavery, abolitionism, and the Black Atlantic. And it's this idea of how problematic the notion of the age of abolition can be as this umbrella term that brings the end to slavery and the slave trade in the Atlantic world, and somehow puts all the elements back in place. And I think that you explain very good in the book how the process of abolishing the slave trade and the slavery is not a straightforward process. It's actually gradual and lengthy and problematic. So perhaps you can elaborate a bit more on that, and perhaps also say something on how is the end of the slave trade and the slavery, how does it affect Africa, and how is it linked to colonization?
Okay, so hi Joy. So for those who don't know, Joy and I actually shared office at some point. So listen, it didn't last for little, it lasted for long, lasted for decades. But in Spanish we have this phrase that I think in English it exists as well. The road to hell is paved with good intentions. And now that Jesus brought up what happens after, I always think about Star Wars and Emperor Palpatine telling everybody that this is for the good of a republic. Well, sometimes people tell you something that needs to be done that is good, is going to have a good result, and it does in the long term. Yes, the transatlantic slave trade was abolished. There were no more ships crossing the Atlantic with human beings being uprooted and taken away from the loved ones, et cetera, et cetera. So in my opinion, abolition, I try to make this point very often, abolition it was not this pristine cause that we have been led to believe. It was a much more complicated cause. It had a very positive, a very worth of price dimension that we should never deny. We should never say abolition was just a way of expanding free trade in the world. It goes much beyond that. This was a popular movement as well behind it. But there is also a very strong argument to put forward that abolition actually served as a backdoor for colonialism, proto-colonialism, if you want, and for European expansionism and American expansionism in the 19th century. The scramble for Africa in 1885 would never have happened had not been for two main reasons. One of them is abolition, and the other one is that medical practitioners by the mid-19th century, 1840s, give or take, are going to figure out what is the best way of giving quinine to those who are suffering from malaria. Until that moment, they were giving malaria right, left, and center in very, very questionable ways. But they figured out which is the best way to give malaria to people who are suffering from malaria fevers. And this happens in the 1840s, and obviously a few years later, there is an influx of Europeans and Americans arriving in Africa for the first time, and arriving and not dying. I actually closed the book with this phrase. There is a British surgeon who spent 20-something years in Africa, and in 1857, if I recall well, he says, we should not call West Africa the white men graves anymore, because by that time, they have figured out the way of getting over this. But this is what is going to follow is pretty much a colonial or an imperial race, right? The Belgians are going to try to get in what is today the Bight of Benin, and the British are going to stop them. The British and the French are going to be fighting for every worth beachhead that they can find along the coast of Africa. The French are going to have an anti-slave trade squadron in Africa, which is going to be larger than the British in the 1840s. And trust me, these people are actually doing the very best as well to stop the slave trade. But at the same time, they have orders to explore, to examine the coastline for places where they can actually create settlements. And of course, the French are going to be more successful than anybody else when it comes to Africa and African colonialism later on. The British are going to bomb Lagos in 1851 to get King Kotoko out of there, because he was a slave trader. He was a terrible human being. But what they are going to do is that instead of walking away after that and put a puppet king, as they wanted to do, is that they are going to establish a protectorate in 1851. And 10 years later, Lagos, where this Nigeria, is going to become a British colony. And like that, you can find examples from the Germans, you can find examples from the French, the Dutch. Everybody's trying to, Spaniards, everybody's trying to create their own beachhead during this year, and abolition is going to allow them to do that. Right? It's not only the slave traders are doing the same, by the way, but the cause of abolition allows them to do that. The justification for them to be there in the first place, right? And there is one more thing that is not necessarily related to territorial expansion, and it has to do with free trade, right? This is the 19th century. This is Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill years. Utilitarianism is at its peak. Actually, probably it's going to have another peak later on, but anyway. And there is this need of convincing the world by any means, being negotiation or gunboats, that everybody has to open the ports to trade with Europeans, right? I mean, and these are the British mostly. The Dutch, for instance, are doing something different. They're doing their own thing with protectionism. But the British are going to start forcing everybody to trade. And we know how they do that. Very often they convince people to sign treaties, etc., etc. But when they don't cut the deal, and there is a classic case on the other side of the war in China, the Opium Wars, they are going to send their own ships. So, you know, it's a complex history that is very far from good and bad, right? Each of these enterprises has a laudable, a prizable side. Utilitarianism actually has it. Free trade to a certain extent has it as well. But then the way they are implemented, the way they are interpreted by different people is going to leave much to the side.
And I think that the underlying message is that for a lot of different actors in the Atlantic world outside of the British Empire, abolitionism was just another thing that the British Empire was pushing down their throat. And you know, we can absolutely agree with the benefits of abolitionism for Africans, but it was also perceived as an imperial imposition by other actors, and therefore it fell within the same category as any other some other terrible things. And just one final question before we say goodbye. Do you think that African practitioners were traditionally viewed as less than because European Americans were clueless about African practices, or is it an ego problem? I feel like many Westerners feel superior to them and refuse to accept that African Black people could be highly qualified and could teach them things.
Yeah, and you get this into today. It's called racism. It's prevalent in the period. Africa was seen as always through a dual lens of dual epithets, good and bad, white and black, light and dark. And Africa always ends up in the bad category. Sorry, and that goes as well for all sorts of interpretation of African knowledge of botany, medical history, etc., etc. Very often, this is what you get in the sources, and people are really those who are narrating are pretty much taking an air of superior tone. This is particularly the case with Christian missionaries, by the way. I actually used one of them in the introduction, a Welsh Christian missionary. So, you know, I think it's the only Welsh person in the whole book, but I use it as an example because this is a missionary who arrived in Africa, and pretty much everything he sees is bad, it's negative, and these people need to be civilized. And of course, this is something I didn't talk about it, and I'm not going to say now, but civilization here is central to everything. So thank you very much, Albir, for this question. And yes, it's going to play along racial lines and civilizational lines, right? Because the Europeans and the white people, they pretty much thought that they were better. Yeah, as they very often think today.
Okay, we've run out of time, so I think we're gonna stop here. Thank you very much, Manuel, for coming along to talk to us. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you very much to all the people who have participated and sent the questions. And thank you very much as well to all of our students who joined the conversation and who've been working with your book this week. I think it's been a very interesting experience for everyone, and it's always great to be able to, you know, ask the author after you read the book. So thank you so much for coming along.
Thank you, Manuel, so much.
Thank you.